In this course, you're learning how to read cities. And while some of the most fascinating ways of reading cities is down on the ground in the city, looking around at what you see and trying to discern how it got to be that way, it's also very useful to look at plans or maps of cities because they can tell us a lot about how the city might have grown or changed over time. This is what I would call an archaeology of the plan. We can do a kind of excavation into the plan, in a way, dig into the plan and look at it closely to see patterns of growth, where the city was founded, how it grew over time, and how it maybe developed networks of streets and patterns of growth that then were extended into the later centuries and up until our time. Cities tend to preserve, in a way, in their plan, records of their foundation and growth, and it just takes a little bit of curiosity and imagination to be able to see that in operation. We're looking at a modern plan of the city of Florence, and Florence was a classic case of a European city founded by the Romans that grew and changed substantially over the course of the Middle Ages and then into the Renaissance. And so what we're going to do is look at that plan of Florence and try to perceive where the city was founded, how it might have grown and changed, and where its last circuit of walls might have actually been. So let's zoom in a little bit to look at the city of Florence in its older parts and try to discern those patterns of foundation and growth. Florence, again being a Roman founded town, would have had a core of the city as a grid, because the Romans always founded their towns as a grid, always as much as possible on the north-south or cardinal orientations. So the Roman city would have had a major north-south street, the Cardo, an east-west street, the Decumanus, and a circuit of walls, a rectangular or square circuit of walls that would have defined the perimeter. And we can see that when we look into the city of Florence, that Roman core, because what happened outside of that Roman core has a less predictable formal pattern of development. It's much more complex and harder to define. And because it's so complex and hard to define, it makes the Roman plan even more clearly evident. So we can see, we can trace the circuit of the Roman walls. They would have been here on the left, on the street known now today as Via Tornabuoni. They would have turned and run east-west here and run right around where the current Duomo or cathedral of the city of Florence is. Come down on what's now known as the Via del Proconsolo, which recalls its Roman governor. And then along the south would have ended just before, in fact, the Piazza della Signoria, where the city hall is, the Palazzo Vecchio, which is here. And that Roman circuit of walls therefore defined the edge of the founded part of the Roman town with its Cardo, the north-south street, and its Decumanus, the east-west street. At the intersection of the Cardo and Decumanus, the Romans always placed their forum, and we can still see that today because even that's preserved in the city plan. Now, that forum became essentially a market in the Middle Ages and changed a little bit in terms of its configuration. In the 19th century, they demolished the market and created a whole new, essentially, edge for that piazza space, now known today as the Piazza della Repubblica. But we can see it very clearly in the plan, how it represents that Roman forum or kind of heart of the public life of the city of Rome. Florence didn't exist in isolation in the Roman Empire, and that founded town, which was set away from the Arno River, as we can see here, the Romans, again, always oriented their cities north-south if they could. And in this particular case, the Arno wasn't running due east-west, but it also tended to flood. And so for prudence sake, they kept the city a little bit away from the banks of the Arno River. They would have needed a place to cross the Arno, however, and the Roman Cardo probably extended due south until it got to the river, and would have crossed the river probably somewhere about here on a wooden bridge that no longer exists, and then would have connected south this way towards the city of Rome, effectively. A street would have led out of the Decumanus to the east, and we still see that street today. Another street would have led out north towards Bologna across the Apennine Hills, and out the west end of the Decumanus, and this way towards the modern city of Prato. Now, when the Romans founded these towns, they were often founded as essentially military encampments. They were founded either for retired soldiers or as an active military outpost. So they tended not to have things like entertainment facilities like theaters or amphitheaters. But those soon were built as the Roman city grew and transcended that original function. The old Roman theater is probably here under the what's now known as the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall. And that's harder to see, but we can see the Roman amphitheater because its form is preserved more or less in the shape of the streets here. That oval form that the streets represents the shape of the old Roman amphitheater, which was essentially built on top of by medieval builders who essentially cannibalized its materials and built residential buildings on top with the street wrapping around the outside. So we can still see that form today. And it probably also means that Romans too lived out that way. The Romans would have built houses and developed neighborhoods beyond the old original circuit of walls, along streets near the amphitheater and the theater, and certainly close to the Tiber River, to the Arno River. But then the Roman Empire collapsed, and as the empire collapsed and the populations were decimated of cities like Florence, those few people who were left tended to shrink and move back down into the heart of the city. And in fact, in Florence, they actually built a smaller circuit of walls to, essentially provide a smaller defensive perimeter for that reduced population. But very quickly, Florence, among all cities of Italy, recovered. It was one of the fastest growing cities of the Middle Ages and became a very important trading post and also a place that produced lots of bankers and a whole kind of banking industry that operated across Europe and, in fact, across most of the known world at that time. So Florence grew outside of that Roman circuit of walls. It would have grown along those Roman corridors of streets and other streets that would have been built in the intervening centuries. It would have grown towards the original cathedral of Florence, San Lorenzo, which is here. And a place like San Lorenzo would have developed its own neighborhood, really, that would have essentially been a neighborhood of artisans and people who would have been involved with building and supporting the community there at the church. So by the 12th century, the Florentines needed a new circuit of walls, one that would incorporate this and capture this larger perimeter. And they started building a circuit of walls that would effectively capture that new growth of the city and probably allow for a little bit of extra growth, but probably not a lot, and certainly not enough, as we'll see in just a minute. So we can see that circuit of walls, that first medieval circuit of walls, in a pattern of streets, because as these walls were demolished, they typically were either they were incorporated into blocks of buildings or they were replaced by streets. And we can see those streets in the circuit of walls here. And they would have gone up and captured San Lorenzo, come back towards the southeast, probably captured a gateway here at the extension of the old Roman Decumanus, come down this way towards the Arno River and captured the neighborhood around the old Roman amphitheater, and then done something like this and come closer to the Arno River. And what they would have done, therefore, that the Romans didn't do is include the Arno River in the city of Florence, that the Arno would effectively become a part of the city, and the area across the Arno, known as the Oltrarno or across the Arno, would have been an integral part of the city when it would always previously have been a sort of hinterland or outpost. So that 12th century circuit of walls extends this way. It would have come down here, and what it would have provided here was a gateway for a very important street, because it was a street that would have taken you now in the medieval city across the river here at the Ponte Vecchio, which we call the Old Bridge today, the Ponte Vecchio, because it's the first bridge of the medieval city. And that street would have extended this way and continued down here, and as you see its name, Via Romana, was really the street that took you to Rome, the Roman street. So that was very important for the medieval city, its connection to Rome. And so there would have been a gateway here as that circuit of walls approached this hill, and then would have hugged the foot of the hill, run along the base of the hill essentially, and wrapped its way around somewhere to about here. And then sort of again approached the Arno River and would have included the Arno River as within the defensive perimeter of the city of Florence. But interestingly, that circuit of walls would have only been good for about 100 years, and by the end of the 13th century, at the end of the 1200s, in around 1296, the Florentines realized that they needed a much larger circuit of walls. Some of the things that had happened in the interim were that two large preaching orders had arrived in Florence, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and like in a lot of Italian cities, they wanted lots of land, they wanted to build big churches, but they also gathered large crowds for their famous preachers, and sometimes the crowds couldn't fit in the church, and so they needed a large outdoor piazza where they could preach their sermons. So the Dominicans here to the northwest at Santa Maria Novella, and the Franciscans here to the southeast at Santa Croce, not only built large churches, but also developed a piazza, and really a whole kind of community of buildings and a neighborhood grew up around them. They also had large fields where they could essentially provide their own sustenance, and they were, in a way, cities within cities. But as you can see, they were outside of that 12th century circuit of walls. And so the Florentines realized that they needed to do some thinking and to fundamentally increase their sense of scale and scope. And so we need to do the same thing. We need to zoom out and look at that larger and last circuit of medieval walls.